There are certain streets that look peaceful, even when something evil is growing inside them. Neat lawns, porch lights, the soft hum of television sets behind curtains. But sometimes, beneath all that quiet, something begins to stir. Something that notices you before you ever notice it. It began on a cold night in late November, in a small town just outside Chicago. A man named Daniel Brooks lived at the end of Willow Creek Drive. A modest neighborhood, safe, quiet, the kind of place people move to forget the chaos of the city. For 3 years, Daniel had come home to the same silence, the same routine. Until the house next door was sold. The new neighbor introduced himself as Mr. Keller. Polite, grey hair, soft-spoken. Too soft, in fact. Like every word had been practiced. Nobody knew where he came from, or why he chose that particular house. But soon after he arrived, the street began to feel wrong. First came the noises, faint clicks in the night, like the winding of an old camera. Then the lights from Keller's windows, glowing long after midnight, pointing directly toward Daniel's home. And one night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Daniel's door received 3 knocks. Slow, precise, like someone marking time. When he looked through the peephole, Mr. Keller was standing there, calm, smiling, and in a voice that didn't belong in that hour, he said, "I know what you did last night." That was the moment Willow Creek stopped being a quiet street, and the stranger next door began watching. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because the ending of this story will shake you in ways you never imagined. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this story? There are sounds that should never exist after midnight. The quiet shuffle of footsteps where no one walks, the faint creak of floorboards that belong to another house, another life. On Willow Creek Drive, every home had its rhythm, a television murmuring, a refrigerator humming, the wind brushing against fences. But when Mr. Keller moved in, a new sound began weaving through those nights, the click of a lens, steady and deliberate like a heartbeat in metal. Daniel Brooks noticed it first on a Thursday. From his kitchen window, he saw Keller's light turn on in the upstairs room facing his house. The curtain shifted slightly, just enough for a sliver of glass to glint in the darkness, a camera lens, watching, focused. At first, Daniel told himself it was nothing. Everyone's curious about new neighbors. But the next evening at the exact same time, 11:47 p.m., the same light, the same flicker, the same motion. It was a pattern. What unnerved Daniel wasn't just being watched. It was how precise Keller seemed to be. The lights never turned on early or late. The shadow never moved casually. Everything happened as if planned, rehearsed, like someone following a schedule written for someone else's fear. By the 4th night, Daniel tested it. He turned off all his lights and waited behind his curtain, holding his breath. Across the yard, Keller's window was dark for the first time. Minutes passed, silence, and then, in that perfect stillness, Daniel's phone vibrated. An image, sent from an unknown number. It showed Daniel, standing behind his own curtain, exactly as he was at that moment, and beneath the photo, a short message. "Don't hide. I see better in the dark." The next night arrived with a silence too heavy for its own weight. Even the wind seemed to pause outside the houses of Willow Creek Drive, as though the street itself was holding its breath, waiting for the lights to come on again. They did, exactly at 11:47 p.m. Through the thin lace of his curtain, Daniel saw the upstairs window of Keller's house glow in that cold white light once more. But this time, something was different. Keller wasn't behind the glass, not at first. Instead, the light moved slowly, left to right, then right to left, like a pendulum swinging across the dark. And then he appeared, standing perfectly still, facing Daniel's home. In his right hand, Keller held something metallic, a small circular object that glinted like a pocket mirror. He lifted it once toward the light, letting the reflection shimmer across the street, as if signaling someone, or something, inside Daniel's house. Then, just as precisely as before, He lowered the object, drew the curtain, and the window went black. It was a ritual now. Every night, the same sequence. The light, the reflection, the stillness. Daniel began timing it, writing it down. He didn't know why. Maybe to prove to himself that there was reason in the madness. But the more he tracked it, the more he realized something sinister. The pattern matched his own movements. When he stayed up late working in his office, Keller's light came on. When he went to the kitchen, the reflection flashed again. When he turned his bedroom lamp off, Keller's went dark too. It wasn't random observation. It was imitation. Keller wasn't just watching, he was mirroring. By the end of that week, Daniel had stopped sleeping near windows. He taped black garbage bags across the glass, double-checked the locks, left every light on. And for 3 nights, the street was finally quiet, until the 4th night. At 2:17 a.m., the same cursed time, Daniel's phone buzzed again. A new message. This one was a video. The thumbnail showed his own bedroom door, and though he was alone in his house, he could hear breathing on the other side of it, faint, deliberate, listening. In the days that followed, Daniel began to notice the silence between the sounds, the gaps, the spaces where something invisible waited. It was in those small, empty seconds that the house seemed to listen back. At first it was only the occasional creak, an old home sighing with age. But soon there was rhythm, whispers, a low hum that followed Daniel from room to room, as if the walls were whispering secrets too quiet to understand. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks on him, until the voices began answering. Late one night, while brushing his teeth, he heard it again, the muffled sound of a man speaking through the bathroom wall, calm, slow, almost familiar. Daniel turned off the faucet, leaned closer, and there it was. "You shouldn't ignore him, Daniel." He froze. The voice wasn't Keller's. It was his own. The sound came not from outside, but from within the wall, a distorted echo of his own tone, repeating fragments of thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud. He backed away, trembling, and the whisper followed, like static crawling behind his ears. That night, Daniel barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Keller's face reflected in that tiny mirror across the street, unmoving, patient, as if waiting for Daniel to react. By the 3rd night, Daniel couldn't take the silence anymore. He turned on the TV just to drown it out. But when the screen flickered to life, it didn't show a channel. It showed him, a live feed, from his own living room. The camera angle was from above, looking down on him, and from the faint reflection in the TV screen, Daniel could see Keller's window glowing again. Only this time there was no light inside it, just 2 small red dots blinking slowly, like eyes recording every move. By the time the first snow began to fall over Willow Creek Drive, Daniel's home no longer felt like his own. The air inside it had weight, a stillness that pressed down on every breath. Each night, the television would flicker, whispering shapes of static even when unplugged. And through the floorboards he could sometimes feel a pulse, a faint vibration that matched no machine, no rhythm he could explain. He told himself he'd imagined the live feed, that no one could really be watching from inside his house. But the next morning, when the sunlight cut across his living room floor, he noticed something new. A perfect round hole in the plaster above the TV, no larger than a coin. Inside it, a glint, metallic, deliberate. He climbed onto a chair, reached up, and felt the edge of a cold lens. A camera, wired through the wall. Every instinct told him to run next door, to confront Keller, but the thought froze halfway, because the wire wasn't leading toward Keller's house. It ran deeper into his own wall, disappearing downward, toward the basement. The basement. He hadn't been down there in months. Daniel fetched a flashlight and opened the narrow door behind the kitchen. A smell of dust and metal rose to meet him, and something else underneath it, faintly sweet like decaying fruit. The light trembled across shelves, boxes, pipes, until it stopped on a door he didn't remember installing. Thin plywood, painted the same color as the wall, but freshly so, the edges clean. He pushed it open. Inside was a small windowless room, and against the far wall, a table. On it sat a monitor, still glowing. The screen showed a grid of 9 camera feeds, all angles of Daniel's house, bedroom, kitchen, hallway, even the bathroom. Each feed was stamped with a date and time, except one. The top left window was labeled only with a single word. Keller Daniel leaned closer. The image was dark, grainy, but as the frame adjusted, he saw movement. A figure standing in front of a screen, watching him through another feed. It was a loop. Both of them, staring into each other's eyes through glass and light, trapped inside an endless reflection. Then Keller raised his hand on the screen, slowly, deliberately, and waved. Daniel dropped the flashlight. When it hit the floor, the basement went black. But from somewhere inside the walls came the sound of a new recording beginning. A soft click, then another, and another. By now, the house no longer slept. Even in daylight, the rooms felt bruised by the nights that came before. Every surface seemed to hum with memory, walls that remembered the whispers, floors that recalled each step. For 2 days, Daniel left the basement door locked, pretending the screen and the cameras were gone. He tried to fill the silence with music, with phone calls, with anything that didn't sound like breathing through drywall. But Keller's window stayed lit. Always the same hour, always the same quiet figure standing behind the curtain. The first knock came on a Sunday. 3 sharp taps on Daniel's front door. Spaced, measured, patient. When he looked through the peephole, the porch was empty. He waited, counted to 10, exhaled. Then 3 more. Louder. He called the police that night. They searched the yard, the porch, the street. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Just the faint smell of old paint and a smear of something metallic on the door frame, like dust from a camera shutter. The next night, it returned. Not at the door this time, but at the walls, tapping from the inside, first behind the television, then beneath the stairs. Each knock followed him as he moved through the house, as though Keller could hear every breath and answer with his own rhythm. Daniel began writing the times down again. 2:17 m, 2:19, 2:22, each knock slower, heavier, closer. At 2:30 the sound stopped. He dared to breathe. And then the doorbell rang once, a single long note that didn't stop until he pulled the plug from the wall. When the silence finally fell, Daniel turned toward the window. Keller's house was dark for the first time, but in the reflection of the glass, Daniel saw movement, his own front door opening slowly behind him, though he hadn't moved an inch. When Daniel finally turned, the front door stood open by less than an inch, just enough for air to move through. The night outside was motionless. No wind, no sound, only the faint static hum that had become part of his life. He approached slowly, whispering his own name as if to test whether the house still recognized his voice. The floorboards complained beneath his weight, every step echoing down the hallway. He reached the door and stopped. There were footprints, bare, pressed into the thin layer of dust that gathered near the threshold. They led inward, from the porch into the house, and stopped exactly where he stood. No sign of anyone leaving. Daniel stepped back, heart thundering. He shut the door, bolted it twice, and turned off the lights, trying to convince himself it had always been locked. But the sound of breathing started again, not behind him, not outside, from the hallway closet. The air shifted. The door of the closet creaked open on its own, no more than a few inches. Inside, darkness, and a faint red light blinking at eye level. Another camera. Its lens was warm, freshly used. On impulse, Daniel yanked it from the wall and smashed it against the floor. The tiny bulb flickered, then died. For a moment, he felt victorious, until he noticed the reflection of Keller's window across the street, glowing again. And within that rectangle of light, Keller was standing, holding a camera identical to the one Daniel had just destroyed. He raised it slowly, pointed it at Daniel's house, and pressed the button. A flash of white, then another. With every burst of light, Daniel saw fragments of movement inside his own home, shapes he couldn't name, shadows that shouldn't be there. He stumbled backward, fell against the wall, and in that instant the phone buzzed again. A message. No image this time. Just text. Open the door. I'm already inside. By the following morning, Willow Creek had lost its sound. The wind no longer touched the fences. The birds no longer crossed the sky. Even the snow fell without noise, slow, heavy flakes drifting down like ash. Inside his house, Daniel tried to make sense of time. The clocks still ticked, but never together. The kitchen clock was 3 minutes fast, the one in the hall 4 minutes slow. The television flickered at 2:17 a.m., no matter what hour it really was. It was as if the world had slipped sideways, caught between seconds. He began hearing the static again, faint at first, like distant radio chatter. It came from behind the walls, under the floor, inside the air vents. Sometimes it formed words, sometimes it laughed, and sometimes it simply repeated his name in a tone that wasn't Keller's and wasn't his own, but something between. When Daniel spoke aloud, the sound bounced back a heartbeat later, distorted, heavier, layered with another voice that echoed him. A mirror made of sound. Across the street, Keller's window never closed. The light inside pulsed now, not steady, as if something was breathing with it. Daniel realized that the two houses, his and Keller's, had begun sharing something invisible, a thread of noise connecting them like veins. He could feel it under his skin. When he moved his hand, he swore he heard the same movement inside the wall respond, a fraction of a second late. At dawn, he tried to leave. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, but the air outside felt wrong. Thick, dense, humming. Every house on the street looked slightly tilted, every shadow a little too long. And when he looked back at his own window, someone was standing there. Not Keller, not him. Just a shape made of static, blinking slowly as if learning how to exist. The following week passed without daylight. It wasn't that the sun had vanished. Daniel simply stopped noticing when it rose. Each morning looked like evening, and every shadow moved slower than it should, like a film running at half speed. He had unplugged every device in the house, televisions, radios, even the smoke alarms. Still, the static remained. It lived now in the air, thin and whispering like dust made of sound. The neighbors had begun to change too. The woman across the street, once cheerful and loud, now stood on her porch for hours staring at Keller's window. Mail piled on her steps. Her lights never turned off. Daniel tried to ask her if she'd noticed anything strange, but when she turned her head, her eyes were unfocused, her mouth moving slightly, repeating words he couldn't hear, like someone silently rehearsing a script. Inside, Daniel filled the basement with blankets to block the noise. It didn't help. The static had rhythm now, short bursts followed by long silences. He recorded them, hoping to find meaning, and when he played the tape back, he heard something that made his chest tighten. "Don't leave. You're part of the recording now." The voice was calm, measured, and layered with his own. He ran upstairs, heart pounding, and looked through the window. Keller's house was no longer lit, every curtain drawn. No sign of life, but from the quiet sky above, the sound returned. Faint at first, like a distant frequency tuning in. And as it grew louder, Daniel realized it wasn't coming from Keller's home anymore. It was coming from every radio, every speaker, every wire in town. His voice, replayed, slowed, multiplied, echoing across the airwaves. And somewhere within that endless static, Keller answered. Not in words, but in the rhythm of the knocks that started it all. 3 precise taps, a pause, 3 more. It began as a rumor, a low hum reported by the residents of Willow Creek Drive, a sound that lingered in their homes long after midnight. At first, it was dismissed as faulty wiring, interference, or the wind against the power lines. But within a week, the hum evolved into a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more, always at 2:17 a.m. By then, Daniel had stopped answering the phone. He sat in the dark with his back to the wall, listening as the sound grew louder each night. Every speaker, every radio, every cell signal carried fragments of the same rhythm. It wasn't just in his house anymore, it was in everyone's. Neighbors who once avoided Keller's home began standing outside at night, drawn toward the flickering window like insects to a light that promised warmth but gave none. They didn't speak to one another. They simply watched, waiting. Local authorities investigated for a day, then left without comment. The power company denied any issue. And yet, each household continued to receive the same late-night broadcast, a faint voice buried in static. "You're being recorded. Stay where you are." The message repeated 3 times before fading. Some claimed it sounded like Daniel, others swore it was Keller. But when compared, both voices were identical in tone and cadence, as if the same person had spoken twice. By the end of the month, the street fell silent again. No lights, no movement, only the faint pulse of unseen electricity running beneath the ground. And in the middle of it all, Daniel's house stood open, every door wide, every curtain torn down. On the living room wall, someone had drawn a perfect circle, inside it a pattern of dots and dashes. Morse code, the investigators said, a translation of the same message heard on every transmission. "We see you now." Months later, Willow Creek was marked as uninhabited. The street remained intact, fences standing, mailboxes full, curtains frozen in half-drawn positions, but no one lived there anymore. The city sealed it off, citing structural contamination from radio interference, a phrase that sounded clinical, safe, and meaningless. The recording equipment retrieved from Daniel's basement was stored in an evidence locker. Every device played the same final entry. The audio began with the familiar static, then a single voice, calm, precise, detached. "This will be the last recording." After that, silence. But if the tape was left running for long enough, faint noises emerged beneath the hiss. Breathing. A second voice. The same rhythm again. 3 taps, pause. 3 more, looping, until the reel ran out. Technicians who reviewed the files reported anomalies, background frequencies that shouldn't exist in human range, identical waveforms repeating at irregular intervals. One technician claimed that, when slowed to 1/4 speed, the hum formed words. "We're still here." He refused to listen again. Weeks passed. The recordings leaked online, copied and remixed by curious users who believed they'd uncovered an abandoned numbers station. Some reported hearing names embedded in the static, their own names. Others heard nothing at all until they tried listening after midnight. By then, the Keller property had been demolished. But residents from nearby towns said that, on windless nights, they could still hear faint tapping carried through the power lines, a pulse moving between houses, never stopping. Authorities blamed faulty transformers. Engineers blamed residual signal bounce. But those who lived close enough to feel it said something different. They said the sound was watching, and sometimes, when it recognized you, it went quiet, as if it had already found what it was looking for. When the recordings finally ceased, Willow Creek faded from conversation. Maps removed the street name. Mail stopped arriving. Only a few investigators still visit, drawn not by evidence, but by the quiet that lingers there. They describe it the same way every time. The air heavy, the world slightly misaligned as though reality itself is buffering. In that silence, if one listens long enough, the faintest echo remains. Not sound, not voice, but recognition. A feeling that something has learned to imitate life too perfectly to disappear. Because stories like this don't end. They replay. Somewhere, in a different town, a new neighbor moves in next door. Polite, ordinary, curious. And late at night, when the house settles and the wind dies, 3 soft knocks come from the wall. A pause. 3 more. The pattern begins again.